Hello and welcome to Meta TV, the Italian party of the organization DiEM25. Today, Owen Gilmartin joins us to talk about an extremely urgent topic to tackle. He is a writer, translator, Jacobin contributor, and host of the Sobremesa podcast. In my opinion, the best English speaking podcast about the Spanish, political landscape, Spanish history, etc. And he's here today to discuss migration. We're gonna discuss his recent Jacobin article, which is titled "Migrant Deaths Off Spain's Coast Are Worse Than Ever." Owen, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Hey, Tiara, great to be back with you. It's always a pleasure to talk.
Thank you. You're joining us from Madrid, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, from Madrid.
In your article, right, you quote a Malian survivor of one of the tragedies resulting from the migrant vessel journeys in the Mediterranean. You cite him as he told you about witnessing the death of an entire family. I'm going to quote from your article. The father ended up throwing himself into the sea once he placed the last of his children into the water. We had no strength left to stop him. Can you tell us about the conditions these migrants traveled to Europe in?
I guess, Jeff, first off, just one correction. He was discussing the migrant route on the Atlantic Ocean. And I think that's a key distinction here, because when we talk about sort of record numbers of deaths of irregular migrants trying to reach the Spanish coast, it's primarily via the Atlantic Ocean and via West Africa. That's not an accident. What we're seeing is, with the sort of Central European routes blocked, with the sort of crackdown, particularly in Tunisia and Libya, that there's been extra migratory pressure put on the sort of Atlantic routes to the Canary Islands. It's been a topic I've been looking at for the last sort of 4 or 5 years, particularly since the pandemic. There's been increasing numbers traveling to the Canaries, and particularly in the last 2 years since the agreement signed between the EU and Tunisia, which basically saw the Tunisian route largely blocked through just vicious repression, the use of arbitrary detention, rape, etc., as detailed by The Guardian. And what you've seen there is that there's been a 60% reduction of irregular migration to Italy in 2024. But what that has sort of created is extra pressure towards Greece and Cyprus in the east, and then towards Spain in the west, particularly, as I said, to the Canaries. And what stands out with the Canary route is the long distance of these journeys. Is that they, if you think back to the start of the sort of, I don't like using the word migrant crisis, but the start of, I guess, in 2015, when large numbers of Syrian refugees were arriving in the Greek islands. You're talking maybe 10, 20 kilometers between the nearest port in Turkey and the nearest islands in Greece. In the Canaries, we are talking about journeys of 800 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers distance, and not on the Mediterranean, but on the Atlantic Ocean. And we're talking about, 100, 150, 200 people packed into traditional wooden fishing boats called cayucos, and spending minimum 4 or 5 days, but potentially 10 days, 2 weeks. There's been cases of people, out for 18 days on the Atlantic Ocean in these wooden boats, in part because one of the things that happens a lot is that the motors give way. They're not made for these type of long distance ocean journeys. And so you then have boats that are just left adrift on the ocean at the mercy of the waves and the winds. Nearly 10,000 people died trying to reach the Canaries in the last year, which is basically 1 in 6 people who would have made the journey died. I mean, it's largely considered the most dangerous migrant route in the world in that sense, or the most dangerous maritime migration routes. And the conditions themselves, I mean, they're pretty horrific. When you talk to migrants, people are packed in. You're talking, 150 people on board a wooden fishing boat. People cannot move. And so when you talk to people who've made it to the islands, a lot of them, for example, have muscular issues because they were stuck in the same position for maybe 10 days. The people on board have to relieve themselves where they're standing. This creates a huge problem then as well, particularly for if you're out there for 10 days or more. Seawater tends to collect in the bottom of the boat. And a lot of people are dying of awful skin conditions, of skin diseases, because what's happening is they're standing maybe up to their waist in dirty water, which has been mixed in with human waste, engine fuel, diesel or whatever. And after 10 days, like sitting or standing in this in this dirty water, they arrive, their legs, their genitals, their lower bodies all covered in sores. And there were, horrific cases of people dying of that. In the summer, you're talking, you're out in the blazing sun. In the winter, people are dying of hypothermia. And so part of I guess the blocking of routes in the Mediterranean is that we're pushing people towards this, what is literally considered the most dangerous maritime migration route in the world, and they're being forced to risk their lives and spend up to 2 weeks in these horrific conditions. And there's just endless cases. I mean, yesterday, for example, there was a case of a boat which turned up in Trinidad. We don't know when it left or where exactly it left, but it would have been one of the boats that tried to reach the Spanish Canary Islands. Again, I'm sure most of your viewers maybe are familiar with the Canary Islands because they're a holiday destination. We've all been for, like, a lot of people have been for weeks sort of sun and beach holiday. And yeah, you have these people who are a boat yesterday which washes up in Trinidad, maybe have left 3, 4, 5 months ago. There's other cases. There was a case, for example, of a boat in September that was found by Senegalese fishermen, and it had set sail in August. There'd been 200 people on board. When they discovered it 6 weeks later, there was 30 bodies on board. Everybody was dead. The bodies were in a state of advanced decomposition after 6 weeks. The quote you said at the beginning, I've talked to a lot of people, but that was actually a quote from a report from Caminando Fronteras. And in that case, and in a lot of cases, what happens is when the motor goes, they run out of water. And I've talked to so many people where maybe they get rescued in the last minute, but they've been like 48, 72 hours without any water. And people are dying. The quote was from a man whose brother also died, who had, in desperation, started to drink seawater. I can't imagine it, like, not having water for 72 hours. In desperation, people end up drinking seawater. His brother died, but yeah, one of the other cases on his boat was a case of a family where everybody died except the father, and then he chose to commit suicide at the end. We're talking about a phenomenon of mass death, which is a direct result of EU policies of Fortress Europe, taking place off the coast of one of the most well-known and visited tourist destinations within the EU. So yeah, it's horrific.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that was one of the biggest points in your article, right? The fact that the sort of Mediterranean route has turned into a Mediterranean route, because this is the Canary Islands. For those who maybe can locate them, are like north of Africa, near Morocco, basically at the south of the Mediterranean, but already entering the Atlantic. We will get back to this later, and this is definitely a pretty big point.
I'll just say that, yeah, it is an incredible route, just the sheer scale of it, because you have boats that are coming from as far south as Gambia. Most of them are coming from Mauritania and from Senegal, which are arriving to El Hierro, which is the smallest of the Canary Islands. Only has 11,000 people. A permanent population of 11,000 people. 20,000 people have arrived there in 2024. But there's also boats then coming from southern Morocco and from Western Sahara. This is the other question. Western Sahara is Africa's last colony. This is slightly off topic, but one of the things that has happened in recent months is France has recognized sovereignty of it. There's cases in Western Sahara in particular where people are trying to board boats and the Moroccan police just open fire and people have been shot in the head and killed. There is an attempt to create the same type of policies, and they worked, for example, in the north of Morocco, between the sort of Straits of Gibraltar, would have been the most common route for irregular migrants and refugees a decade ago. But Morocco has now pretty much sealed that route, and so you have people out in the Atlantic Ocean.
I do want to ask you though. We see a large range of NGOs, right? You also point to this in your article, actually. A large range of NGOs taking the role of helping migrants in distress. Do you regard this fact as alarming? What would be a more desirable and sort of productive, effective alternative, in your opinion?
It is a bit distinct in the Mediterranean because you would obviously have NGOs that are doing maritime rescues, and that doesn't take place around the Canaries and the Atlantic. They depend only on the Coast Guard, but there are NGOs which, I mean, the big one. I mean, even the figures that I quote are from a report by an NGO, Caminando Fronteras. I did a big investigative project last year with a group of journalists on unmarked migrant graves, and one of the things we realized very quickly was there's ample data on the number of irregular migrants that are detained or that are detected or that are processed, etc. But there's no data on the number of people dying on these routes, no official data. And so it does depend on NGOs just to even have figures about the numbers of people who are dying. And Caminando Fronteras does a whole range of series. In part, for example, they have a sort of helpline, which a lot of migrant boats, when they get into distress, if they manage to get a signal, they'll contact them first. And that's, in part, that signals the fact that, they see the Coast Guard maybe as potentially hostile or, getting in contact. And it is the issue, and we'll probably come back to this as well, but that within a policy of border control and deterrence, even rescue, even like Coast Guard, Coast Guard rescues has been turned into another mechanism of trying to deter migrants, of trying to, being very careful not to create a so-called pull factor of making it supposedly easy by actually rescuing people. No, I mean, European borders have been turned into these sort of extra legal zones in which basic human rights protections, basic rules of, the laws of the sea are just, are suspended. It's a zone of exception for these people. So there is that element. And then, on the Canary Islands, for example, I was in El Hierro in August and September, and it's an island, where you have a population of 11,000, 20,000 people have arrived in the last year. I mean, that's a huge stress on an island. I think it has one hospital with 32 beds, only 32 beds. There's no infrastructure needed to cope with these numbers of people. We're in a situation where the Spanish far right are weaponizing this issue. Unlike in the rest of Europe, Vox, the Spanish far right, made their breakthrough around the question of Catalan independence, about confronting the so-called internal enemy, Catalan separatists, not about the external threat of migration. But I think with Catalan independence sort of taking a back seat in recent years, they've been looking for a new sort of discursive focus, and they have now very much, pivoted to an anti-migration line. And they would describe, for example, El Hierro as the Spanish Lampedusa, or the Lampedusa of the Atlantic. But the local people in El Hierro, the local administration is a sort of soft left administration. Well, it's a coalition between the centre-left Social Democrats and the Communists, Izquierda Unida. And they're very proud of the fact that they've had this huge pressure on their island, on their infrastructure, on their services, but they've managed to avoid the sort of scenes of collapse that maybe you saw in Lampedusa a couple of years ago. Because that's what the far right want. They want scenes of like just, the local services not being able to cope, etc., of a supposed invasion. Because again, the numbers arriving to Spain, they represent a humanitarian drama for an island of 11,000 people and for the sort of wider Canary Islands in themselves. But for a country of 48 million people, you're not talking about an extreme burden. It's just the fact that you have these pressure points. They arrive in one place. And what a lot of people on these islands say is, yeah, like local volunteers are the ones, local NGOs are the ones stepping in to cover the gaps. And I think this is true around Europe, is that the sole focus of European policy, migration policy, is on border control. And so everything else is not a priority. It's left to NGOs or local administrations to try and cope with, thousands of people who have arrived in, horrific conditions. The Atlantic route is also known as the children's route. There's thousands of young children. Again, instead of maybe trying to make the arduous journey along, through the desert along the Sahara to the Mediterranean, under it, I talked to a lot of 15, 16-year-olds, and they're arriving in the Canaries, really vulnerable people, some people, the kids who have lost their parents along the way. And so the local services don't have the resources to deal with this. And when things get out of control, you will see the government step in and giving them funding. But what they want is long-term planning. This isn't an issue that's probably going to go away. They want to be able to give these people a dignified sort of welcome and reception.
Continuing on the topic of how the border is operating, let's discuss from the European side. So one of DiEM25's pillars is a welcome Europe. Migrants are now victims of Fortress Europe at this time. Its border regime, which you write, and I read, in the name of disincentivizing travel by migrants and refugees from the global south, forces them to expose themselves to even greater mortal dangers, claiming only fraudulently to address the deeper reasons why people would risk such a journey. You address the EU policy of outsourcing border security to third non-EU states such as Morocco or Tunisia. What is the responsibility of the European Union specifically in this crisis?
This is a policy that goes back. I mean, that's why I would call it a border regime. Exactly. It goes beyond any national government, whether centre left, centre right, or far right. No, I mean, a lot of the same basic approach to border control is outsourcing to third party countries, from Turkey all the way across North Africa. I guess Algeria is a bit of an exception. I mean, one of the issues with the genocide in Gaza was I remember talking to MEPs, and they were saying nobody in Europe is concerned about the potential of tens of thousands of Palestinians arriving as refugees because they just signed a deal with Egypt. You outsource border control, and you can sort of ignore the abuses that happen. One of the key sort of innovations in that sense, used in a very negative sense, was the agreement with Libya, EU's agreement with Libya, in which they realized if European Coast Guards or European NGOs are the ones who rescue refugees on the Mediterranean, they are obliged to bring the refugees or the migrants back to the EU. They cannot return them to an unsafe third country. But what you had, and this is something that then becomes replicated, for example, with Spain in the Atlantic, is you'll have EU, you'll have Frontex, the border agency, Frontex drones, Italian aircraft monitoring the Mediterranean, but they won't be the ones who actually intercept the boats. They're working with the Libyan Coast Guard, who also in many cases tend to be, smugglers. And so what you have, and I'm sure most of your viewers and yourself are aware of Sally Hayden's wonderful book, The Fourth Time We Drowned. I really recommend it. It's a really important book. But she describes in it like testimony of Libyan refugees who thought that they had managed, after managing to get on a boat finally from Libya towards Italy, supposedly towards Lampedusa, that when they were out, the boat was sinking, but a European sort of Coast Guard planes were overhead, and they imagined the European Coast Guard was coming. But then who came, of course, was the Libyan Coast Guard, and they were dragged back. And that's happening as well in the Atlantic. And this is having knock-on effects. For example, in the Atlantic, around, you now see the boats cannot go along the coast. You know, the before the boats would have stayed close to the coast, maybe even in certain points gone ashore, and then gone back out onto the sea. But because you have Spanish drones now monitoring the area, they're having to go out further into the ocean. And that's why they're arriving in El Hierro, which is the most westerly route. So they're being forced to take, even on the Atlantic, they're being forced to take even more dangerous routes. So you have these policies which are, obviously they're not actively killing people in general. You have cases maybe like the Melilla massacre, where Spanish border police or the Guardia Civil were actively involved in the deaths of people. But they're being abandoned. They're being selectively abandoned. And I don't know, like Judith Butler, I think, describes it as they're being forced into death, basically. And so it's true. It's not technically murder, but it's a sort of necropolitics in which they're being, the idea is that you disincentivize travel, that you create these sort of pushback factors in which you make it so dangerous and so miserable that supposedly, you know, people will be disincentivized from traveling. But most of the time, you're talking, you know, the largest group that's arriving to the Canaries in the last year are from Mali. 97% or 96% who arrive to the Canaries are given asylum once they arrive, but they have to risk their lives on the Atlantic Ocean first to make that claim. And this is the issue, is that in a lot of cases, and even, you know, people who are just fleeing poverty and a lack of opportunity in Gambia. I mean, I talked to a lot of young people from Gambia in the Canaries, and, you know, they're full of ambitions, full of hopes. Some of them, are walking with limps because of the sort of muscular injuries they picked up from the boats. But, you know, there was so few opportunities for them back home that this was the sort of chance to get to Europe and have a better life. And I think, you can temporarily reduce numbers along certain routes by pushing and creating, you know, migratory pressures elsewhere. But at the end of the day, like, in general, over the last 20, 30 years, it hasn't been enough to really deter people in significant numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back a little bit to what you were saying, in Spanish we say dejar morir también es matar. Basically, leaving someone to die is also a way of murder.
Yeah, it's a sort of, because I think it is important to make the distinction, just because I think there is something horrific about the impersonal nature of it. No, I mean, one of the issues on which I talk about in my piece is, again, the fact that with search and rescue, you'll have NGOs like Caminando Fronteras trying to, you know, receiving calls from people on boats saying we are sinking, or, you know, we've run out of supplies. They give them their location, and it could be days before the Coast Guard turns up. It's always about trying to make sure that the Spanish Coast Guard aren't the ones who go out, that it's the Moroccans, it's the Mauritanians, because then they don't have to come to Spain. Because that potentially, again, would create a push factor, because it's been supposedly too easy on people. It's a horrific, dehumanizing logic that, it's all about de-incentivizing travel. I mean, there was an ironic headline a number of years ago, you know, getting to the core of this. And it was in a sort of awful irony that the headline said, "Drown a migrant to save a migrant." The idea was, okay, maybe a certain number of people will die because of these policies, but you're de-incentivizing, and supposedly in the end, you know, well, I mean, obviously in practice it never works like that. Yeah, no, it's horrific.
Yeah, and let's get into the Spanish government's role in this, right? When examining it, the role in this crisis, you write that discursively, President Pedro Sánchez has clearly stood out among EU leaders in recent months, particularly in terms of his strong rejection of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's plan to send asylum seekers to internment centers in Albania. And you also write that Sanchez's government also looks set to regularize the status of 900,000 undocumented migrants over the next 3 years, after the Spanish parliament passed a bill on the issue in November. The majority of the migrants set to benefit from this are from Latin America and arrived in Spain by airplane, not risking their lives on the ocean. So it's not really a way of tackling this problem, is it?
No, exactly. No, that's a good point, because it's
Yeah.
I think it is a very progressive initiative, and I made that point in the context of this, in the sense that, again, I think one of the things about migration to Spain and irregular migration is, I think 70% of irregular migrants who arrive in Spain come from Latin America, and they arrive in airplanes.
Yeah,
it's more just the fact that what Sanchez and his general discourse, which is more progressive than anywhere else in Europe, what gets left unaddressed is the question of how, if you have people, thousands arriving from conflict zones such as Mali, such as South Sudan, and when they arrive, they are given asylum, or even the fact is Spain needs, the reason why this mass regularization of irregular migrants has bipartisan support in Spain, even on the centre right, is the fact that Spain needs migrants. The agricultural sector in Spain is huge, and it's mainly staffed by migrant labor. Some irregular, some seasonal labor, so-called circular labor, where people are given visa for a particular harvest season. They come for 4 or 5 months, maybe. The working conditions are horrific. Or the other is home help. Either domestic work is done by Latin American irregular migrants, and I think it's very important, because they lack papers. They have no rights, and during the pandemic there was just horrific situations of domestic workers sort of locked up with their employers for months on end, working basically 24 hours a day. I think it is a really positive initiative. It's a grassroots initiative. This comes based on a popular, what do they call it? But it's a popular initiative, popular legislative initiative that was driven by grassroots, migrant groups, associations, and their hard work has finally seen it get to Congreso. It's passed, I think, the first hurdle, its first reading, but it's still going on. It hasn't come into effect yet, but I think that is a very, very positive thing. But yeah, the issue is, and this I think goes back to the European element as well, is the fact that it is also true. Maybe Spain alone cannot be, there's only a European solution to this issue, and you need a mechanism of distribution. On the one hand, there isn't even a functioning distributor, to distribute migrants across Spain. And that's why you end up having these sort of bottlenecks in the Canary Islands and in the North African enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, is that other regions in Spain are refusing to take in particularly young, unaccompanied migrants. And so you have this situation in the Canaries, for example, where there's between 5,000 and 6,000 underage unaccompanied migrants in the Canaries. They only have the capacity for 3,000, and there's teenagers, young people forced to live in warehouses. One of the places they're living in is a warehouse they used to contain pigeons for racing, or I don't know what. So they're being forced into sort of unsanitary conditions, in part because none of the other regions in mainland Spain want to take their quota. More broadly, you need a European response in which other non-frontline countries take the number that they take a proportional number. Again, the numbers of irregular migrants who arrive into Europe they're not unsustainable. The question is how we need to find mechanisms, one, to allow asylum claims to be made outside of EU territory, in embassies maybe, and then the other would be safe passages, either some sort of economic visas for people, particularly because countries like France and Spain with huge agricultural sectors and other sectors, they need labor. Obviously, the big blocking point there is political rather than anything else. It's the direction of political travel Europe is going is only going in one direction. It's primarily that.
Yeah, and I was wondering, what do you believe are the goals, the motivations behind governments such as Sanchez? I wanted to quote you again. Basically, you say that the Sanchez administration has, for example, stepped up aerial and maritime surveillance operations of the Senegalese coast in conjunction with the EU border agency Frontex, which you were getting at, and the Senegalese Navy, right? So this means that Cayucos have been forced to take riskier routes, which you were also getting at, to avoid detection. What do you believe is this progressive government's goal? They are very critical of Giorgia Meloni, but then they act in this manner. What's their approach on migration? What's their goal in regards to it? How far are governments such as Italy's more at fault for the tragedy unfolding compared to governments like the Spanish one? Like, how do you see responsibility being divided here?
I mean, the first part, what the goal of the Sanchez government, in part, I mean, he went on this sort of initiative last summer because it was top of the political agenda. And, part of it is center-left politicians feeling they want to be seen to be doing something. No, they want to be seen to be responding. And part of the border Europe regime is the fact that it does create a certain zero-sum effect in that, okay, you shut one route and then you push people elsewhere, and you create this surge that another government has to deal with a certain focus on right-wing media, where he's being portrayed as soft on migration. I think he's trying to do two things: showing that they can control migration, and at the same time polarizing around certain issues with the right, because it does work electorally for him to be progressive around talking about migration, but really he's primarily talking about regular migration. That it's a positive for Spain, and that polarizing against the sort of xenophobic discourse both of Vox domestically and Meloni internationally, and then linking the PP, the mainstream Conservative Party, to this. So there is, I think, that element politically, and I think it works for him when he stands up. At the moment, he's standing up. Made a discourse in Davos last week, sort of attacking Elon Musk. Again, that plays very well with his base, as does attacking someone like Meloni in Italy. But at the same time, Meloni, obviously the sort of, what would you call it, the sort of theatre of cruelty of her policies. Now, the sort of, and it is much more about being seen to be, just being seen to be cruel, as opposed to, the Albanian policy just legally doesn't seem to be possible. It does play into that same logic of, okay, it's another pushback factor. If migrants know they'll never even get to EU territory, and they'll be housed in these sort of camps in detention camps in Albania, it will be another sort of disincentive. But in terms of the actual people dying at sea, there's not a huge amount of difference. It's the same policies. The agreement with Libya was long in place before Meloni turned up. And various Italian governments had followed that. Obviously, there are degrees and levels and grades, but the sort of core approach to border control is there, and it is the idea that the solution is the militarization and the outsourcing of borders. And at the moment, Mauritania is the weak link in this chain, because you can have, Mauritania is this massive, territorially territorially massive country that only has a population of 4.5 or 5 million people with a coast of 750 kilometers. It's very hard for them to try and reproduce the type of sustained containment policies and repression. And they are in part doing that, but the type of sustained containment policies that we're seeing in Tunisia in the north or Libya. And so, yeah, you have a situation in which the Spanish governments are now trying to get Frontex to physically bring their boats and patrol the waters, because Mauritania itself just cannot cope.
I want to move on to end on a little bit of a discussion on migration at large, because migration is an outstanding characteristic of of humanity, clearly, but of the last 30, 35 years. I think especially if we're talking about Southern Europe, because there's both the conversation about, the Mediterranean perilous journey that migrants take, quite literally risking their lives each time they do that. Now, the Atlantic route as well, in the Southern Mediterranean. But also there is a huge conversation to be had about migration from Southern European countries to Northern European countries, also to the US, the UK, etc. Something I've noticed is that we see professional managerial class digital nomads, they would maybe call themselves, and not only move countries kind of at their leisure, as if the world was one huge shopping center, right? With countries and cities as products to be chosen. An experience, right? Extremely, a pretty clear feature of capitalism there. At the same time, it is not just migrants risking their lives who find themselves having to leave their homes, right? This is the most extreme example. But yeah, like I was saying, beyond this, a lot of Southern Europeans flee their home countries in search of either a better life, trying to follow their dreams, maybe in professional fields that are completely left behind or underdeveloped in our countries, or also to literally get a job. It's not always such a free choice for many people. When the Titan sub imploded in 2023, the public kind of couldn't help but make a comparison to the thousands dying every year in the Mediterranean. It was kind of pretty obvious that parallel was going to be made. I was wondering what you think about this scenario, like this landscape, right? Because does this practice of traveling and moving so nonchalantly, exercised by the PMC, by PMC workers, make a mockery of the tragedy that abandoning one's home is for so many? And also, do you believe if people could, would most of them stay in the places they're from? Would they actually leave if they actually had a choice? I wonder what you think about this, because to me, it's just part of this sector of more wealthy PMC workers. Like, to me, it does feel like a mockery. And then there's also, the response of truly acting like, welcoming migrants that are risking their lives with open arms is this, rainbow happy world of, just brotherhood, when actually I don't really think these people are happy to leave their homes. It pretty much looks to me like they are escaping a fate worse than death, maybe, but not necessarily thrilled about actually coming to any European country. Seems to me extremely twisted, the whole combination of factors. And yeah, the fact that so many people seem to sound gleeful and kind of trying to normalize this constant move from country to country to city, etc. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, God, there's a lot there. I'm going to try and go through a few. I mean, the first thing I guess I would say is one of the positives I take from Spain is the fact that there's been a wave. You know, when we look in terms of protests in the last year, there have been certain anti-migrant protests in Spain. None of them have been massive, but there has been a huge wave of housing protests and anti-tourist protests. And I think this talks to maybe what you're talking about around, you know, the antisocial practices of Airbnb and its clients. I mean, the platform is primarily responsible, but there is an issue of, you know, the hollowing out of neighborhoods in cities across Spain where, you know, local residents are being driven out. The culture has been, you know, shops are being replaced with, you know, terrible sort of, you know, Subway and, you know, Starbucks, etc. And there is an element. So I do think it's a positive thing where you have larger protests around housing. And in Spain, the two issues which are seen as the most important, number one is in the current ranking is housing, and number two is migration. And I imagine they're priorities for quite distinct sets of populations as well. When I remember the first time, I mean, anytime I go to the Canaries, you have that sort of disjuncture, this sort of strange meeting of two worlds where, you know, tourists of all, you know, from various classes and social classes of Western Europe sitting on the beach, enjoying themselves, you know, in El Hierro, the main port where the boats come in or dragged into is world famous for diving. And so you have a lot of tourists there for diving. You have people sitting out having a drink on the terrazas as the boats come in, or, you know, sunbathing. The little harbor has a beach. And you have this very strange phenomenon where the boat is dragged in. Some of the people on board maybe have no signs of life. Others are actually dead, or in some cases they're jubilant when they come in because, you know, they've made it. And, you know, the tourists and the locals are sort of waving, and sometimes they wave back and are shouting stuff. But it is, the freedom to travel versus not. And it is very clear in that sense. Another issue to do with housing, in particular with the digital nomads, is again, the rise of sort of short-term letting alongside holiday lets, short-term lets of, you know, 3 months, 6 months, 11 months for these type of people. I would rather focus on those issues and the needs for the government to clamp down on the antisocial practices of these platforms and of tourists, as opposed to on migrants. But yeah, it goes both ways. I mean, I'm also thinking about how people are treated in death, because again, I was saying there, I did this big project on the unidentified migrant victims and their burial and their identification across Europe. And you can go to graveyards in the Canary Islands, and that's another issue in the Canaries. In El Hierro, they're running out of space because they're having to bury so many people. But I remember in Gran Canaria going to one graveyard, and there's a section for sort of foreigners, and you can see the graves and the gravestones of maybe the tourists who have died. You know, they're marble. I remember seeing one it was obviously an English person. It had his local, you know, he's a Nottingham Forest football supporter. They had like basically a little description of his life. And then beside them were just blank. There was nothing. No, there was maybe just a police number. And that was a graveyard in which the local mayor, who was right wing, had refused to bury any of the bodies for something like 2 years. And so these bodies had been left in a mortuary unburied for 2 years. And eventually the government agreed to pay for everything, and some compromise were reached. And in other cases, you brought up the submarine. No, I mean, that again was an obvious case where it is a question of, and this goes back to Judith Butler, the ungrievability of certain populations. Now, some populations in public discourse are given huge attention, and there's, it's framed as this awful tragedy. You read every detail of their personal life, the reactions of their family, the survivors, what did they say in the last moments? We have all the details, over weeks. And then there are people who are just, hundreds of people who are just being buried anonymously in graves, and no effort is being made to track down their families and let them know what's happened. I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of families in Africa. These are people who tend to get left out of our analysis, but who are just left in limbo, left not sure if their loved one is alive or dead, unable, for example, to very practical things about, collect a widow's pension or questions of custody if the parents are dead. And it would be very easy for the EU and European states to put into place protocols for the identification of these people, but they're not interested. They don't care. And so across Europe's southern border, across Spain's southern border in particular, you have these nameless migrant graves, a lot of times only meters away from graves, mass graves from the Spanish Civil War, also unnamed victims. And yeah, nobody cares. They're very much second-class citizens. We'll never know anything about their lives unless you have a huge tragedy like the Pylos tragedy, where a number of 100 people died in one shipwreck. The monthly shipwrecks where you have 800 people dying a month, these horrific shipwrecks where maybe 50 people are dying. They don't even make national news in Spain, let alone international news. And it's, the inequality in terms of their supposed grievability, their value as victims. They're just sort of erased. They're not, they never appear in the media. If you want to try and find their graves, they're off the back or sometimes just buried in fields, as in certain Greek islands. So, the inequalities continue after death, even in terms of the right to identification, the right to a dignified burial are denied to these people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, ultimately, it is about the fact that the current organization of the economy does imply that large numbers of people live to survive, which is in a very extreme manner the case for this kind of.
And just to get back to what you were saying about like would they want to stay or whatever.
Right.
In some of the cases, I think Senegal is a very interesting case because, again, people are traveling on traditional wooden fishing boats, and that's not an accident. The fact is the fishing economy, which was a key source of employment all along the Senegalese coast, has been decimated by the fisheries agreement with Europe and others with China, in which you have industrial sized trawlers just coming in, and they can't compete. Their fishing stocks are decimated by these trawlers. They're left with no way to make a livelihood, and so they end up literally taking the same boats and trying to reach the Canaries, or in some cases working maybe as smugglers. It is all joined up. We have these trade policies. We support repressive regimes in North Africa. We create these situations. And again, going back to some of those conversations I had with MEPs around Gaza, was that their idea is it really doesn't matter. They can contain it. They signed a huge bilateral agreement with Egypt. It doesn't matter what happens. That border will be sealed. Mm-hmm. We're not going to have a repeat of Syria. Obviously, Gaza is a distinct thing because it's a question of ethnic cleansing and stuff. But from the European perspective, even if Israel managed to actually carry that out, they felt they had enough allies in that area to contain it. Mm-hmm. And so, you have the free movement within the EU, and then just this brutal militarized border regime on its southern border, and then policies of dependency and resource extraction across much of these areas. The relationship between the core and the periphery of neocolonialism, this is all part of it. And it's seriously depressing. I would only say that there are a lot of amazing people working in this area, And I do think, yeah, the campaign around the regularization of of people in Spain, I think that is a small shard of light in this sort of wider landscape of darkness, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the case of Palestine is a pretty important one when highlighting the importance of home, of wanting to stay home. I mean,
yes, exactly. Yes,
it amazes me how strongly their grip is on their land, their home. And I was actually listening to Catherine Liu the other day, kind of discussing how much this idea of the nation is important for Palestinian children, how much meaning it gives to their struggle, really, rather than this idea that we are trying to develop in, these European countries where we are constantly migrating, of your one anchor is ultimately yourself, and it's all about a project of self-improvement. Instead, we see these Palestinian kids whose project is their nation, right? It's their national project, and who live in a community with incredibly large families and an extremely strong grip to their home, right? And I don't know, I guess I would encourage fellow kind of downwardly mobile PMC people to kind of look sideways and look down, because I mean, what these migrants are facing at sea is basically the extreme of living to survive, and survival should never be enough. Unfortunately, this is the role survival has in so many lives. And I think we should try to recognize it in our own, to see that, obviously, to a different extent, but we are ultimately living to survive to an extent which is undignified, which is not something that we should think positively about. It's something we should organize to fight as workers in the periphery of
I totally agree. And I think, again, even going back to this, I mean, it's one of the things we need to avoid is creating, I mean, what the right want to do is create manufactured crises, manufactured conflicts between locals and people arriving. And I think, again, El Hierro gives a positive example where, an island of 11,000 people, they refuse to see it as us or them. No, it's like the idea we need to put in place resources for these people when they arrive, and that they can be given a dignified welcome without having to take away from local resources or services. Same with workers' rights. I mean, the important thing about regularizing the workers in Spain is the fact that they will then gain access to things like the minimum wage and basic labor rights. That's where we need to be looking at, finding ways where, it's sort of a positive sum thing where, these people are given rights. Well, it will bring potentially, I think, up to €1 billion in extra tax receipts in Spain, because, they'll be paying taxes. They'll get labor protections. You won't have the downward pull on wages by having this huge number of people working illegally, etc. Or at least hopefully that will work in that way. And I think it's trying to avoid those manufactured conflicts which the right are so willing to create and then run with.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's important to seek to actually incorporate these workers into our unions, to basically organize together rather than just settling for things like mutual aid. And for that, people do need to be regularized. Absolutely.
Exactly. And I think another actually good example there has been around the the riders' law in Spain, maybe where you do see, the people leading that were a mix of Spanish delivery riders and migrants, and it is about having protections in place for everybody, basically. Yeah. So yeah, no, definitely, I agree.
Absolutely. Okay, Owen, thank you so much. I would encourage everyone to please read your article. We will leave the link to Jacobin here below. And then also obviously your handles for them to follow you. Would you want to encourage them to listen or read anything in particular that you're producing?
I've just finished a long piece on Western Sahara, and I think it's something which has been not received enough attention within left-wing circles in particular. The Court of Justice of the European Union made a historic ruling before Christmas on this, and this is Africa's last colony, and I think it is a key issue. Obviously, understandably, our attention has been on Gaza in the last year, but what's happening in Western Sahara, above all, the EU's role, and France and Spain in particular, I think should be of concern to people on the left everywhere in Europe. And I have to say, this is an area in particular where the French left have been very poor. In part, the communist left in France have taken a strong anti-imperialist line, but Mélenchon, in part because he was born in Morocco and seems to have a strange personal liking of the autocratic Moroccan king, Mohammed VI, has a far from perfect line on this. But I do think Western Sahara needs more attention. It's criminally overlooked by the European left, and I think it is something because billions of euro of European corporate investment is going in to try and make the occupation regime there a economically viable regime, and I think this is something we need to be pushing back on.
Absolutely, and it's not dissimilar to Israel-Palestine.
Exactly. The same. I think the same lawyers in both cases in terms of like settlements and the exports, etc. So yeah, it is very linked.
Yeah. So thank you so much again. We hope to have you back. We hope everyone checks out your podcast. Extremely interesting, especially if you want to learn about Spain and the Spanish landscape right now. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening to us. Thanks everyone for being here. Please subscribe, please follow us, and we will be here discussing all matters Europe, Southern Europe, and with guests such as Owen. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yari. Cheers.